The champagne flutes clinked against crystal in Marcus's family mansion, their laughter echoing through rooms worth more than most people's houses. I stood in the corner of the marble foyer, watching my fiancé of 3 years charm his way through. Another family gathering, his Harvard MBA charm working overtime on relatives who still saw me as the charity case he'd rescued from obscurity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sophia, darling. His Aunt Patricia approached, her Cartier bracelet catching the light from the chandelier above. How lovely that Marcus found someone so grounded. The pause before grounded carried years of subtle condescension. I smiled, politely sipping my sparkling water while she undoubtedly wondered why I wasn't drinking the Dom Pérignon that cost more than my monthly rent. Marcus has wonderful taste, I replied, watching him across the room where he was deep in conversation with his father about the family investment firm. What Patricia didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been building something they couldn't see. While they assumed I was a struggling freelance graphic designer barely making ends meet, I'd been quietly constructing an empire. 3 years ago, when I met Marcus at that charity auction, I was already the anonymous founder behind Meridian Digital, a boutique consulting firm that specialized in corporate rebranding and crisis management. Marcus had approached me that night, drawn by what he later called my refreshing authenticity among the sea of socialites. He'd assumed my simple black dress was from Target, not the custom piece I'd commissioned from an emerging designer I was secretly funding. He'd thought my lack of obvious jewelry meant I couldn't afford it, not that I preferred subtlety to the gaudy displays of wealth surrounding us. I let him think whatever made him comfortable. Sophie's been such a positive influence, Marcus was saying now to his cousin Bradley, their voices carrying across the marble expanse. Really keeps me humble, you know. Dating someone who has to worry about things like grocery budgets gives you perspective. My fingers tightened around the glass. This was the Marcus I'd been seeing more and more of lately, the one who spoke about me like I was a sociological experiment rather than his partner. The one who found my supposed financial struggles charming rather than concerning. Must be nice having someone so low maintenance, Bradley chuckled, adjusting his Rolex. No expensive tastes to worry about. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the gardens where we'd gotten engaged 6 months ago. Marcus had proposed with his grandmother's ring, a modest emerald that he'd presented with apologies for not being able to afford something grander. I'd said yes while secretly knowing that the modest ring was actually worth more than most people's cars, and that I could have bought 10 of them without checking my account balance. The masquerade had begun as self-protection. 3 previous relationships had taught me that men rarely fell in love with wealthy women. They fell in love with what wealthy women could do for them. So when I met Marcus, I'd decided to experiment with a different approach. I presented myself as struggling but optimistic, hardworking but financially limited. The small apartment I maintained in Brooklyn, the second-hand car, the careful budgeting act, all carefully orchestrated props in a performance designed to find genuine love. For a while, it seemed to work. Marcus was attentive, supportive, encouraging about my small freelance projects. He'd take me on dates that he thought were splurges, but were actually quite modest by my real standards. He'd surprise me with gifts from department stores, beaming with pride at his thoughtfulness while I privately noted that I'd donated more expensive items to charity auctions. But lately, something had shifted. The supportive boyfriend had been replaced by someone who seemed to enjoy the power imbalance, someone who found my supposed limitations amusing rather than concerning. "Sophia!" Marcus called out, gesturing me over to where he stood with his parents. "Come tell them about that project you're working on." "The one with the small business?" I approached, noting how his mother, Eleanor's smile, never quite reached her eyes. She'd been polite but distant since the engagement, clearly hoping this phase would pass and Marcus would find someone more suitable to their social circle. "It's just a rebranding consultation," I said modestly, though the small business was actually a Fortune 500 company I was helping recover from a major PR disaster. "Nothing too exciting." "She's being modest," Marcus laughed, putting his arm around my waist in a gesture that felt more possessive than affectionate. "Tell them what you're making." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus knew I was sensitive about money discussions, but lately he seemed to enjoy putting me on the spot about my finances. I could feel his family watching, waiting for confirmation that I was indeed the financial burden they suspected. "It's enough," I said quietly. "Come on," Marcus pressed, his grip tightening slightly. "Don't be embarrassed. We're all family here." Family. The word stung because I'd genuinely begun to hope that's what they could become. That's what I'd thought I was building with Marcus. A real partnership based on genuine connection rather than financial calculation. "Marcus," his father Charles interrupted smoothly, "why don't you show Sophia the new addition to the wine cellar? That Bordeaux collection came in yesterday." I caught the subtle rescue, grateful for the intervention even as I wondered what Charles's motivations were. Marcus's father had always been the most enigmatic member of the family, polite but observant in a way that sometimes made me wonder what he was really thinking. The wine cellar was a climate-controlled masterpiece, each bottle worth more than most people's monthly salaries. Marcus walked me through the collection with the enthusiasm of someone who'd grown up taking such luxuries for granted. "This one," he said, pulling out a bottle that I recognized as worth approximately $5,000. "Dad's been saving for my wedding day. Figured we should start with something special, you know?" The casual mention of our wedding sent a familiar pang through my chest. We'd been planning for 8 months now, with me carefully managing expenses, while Marcus assumed I was stressed about costs rather than orchestrating one of the most elaborate deceptions of my life. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma, my assistant. "At Meridian Digital, the Henderson acquisition cleared. You're officially 40% richer as of this afternoon. Also, Marcus's family hired a private investigator. Thought you should know." The wine cellar suddenly felt colder. I slipped my phone back into my purse, maintaining my expression while my mind raced. A private investigator could only mean one thing. They were looking into my background. The question was whether they were concerned about my suitability for their son, or whether they'd somehow begun to suspect that things weren't what they seemed. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked, noticing my sudden stillness. "Just work stuff," I replied, which was technically true. "Nothing urgent." We returned upstairs to find the family gathered in the main salon, their conversation suspiciously halting as we entered. I recognized the signs immediately. I'd built a career on reading room dynamics and understanding unspoken communications. "Actually," Eleanor said, rising from her position by the fireplace, "we wanted to discuss something with both of you, about the wedding." Marcus straightened, clearly pleased to be included in family discussions. I prepared myself for whatever was coming, noting how each family member's posture suggested this was a planned intervention rather than a casual conversation. "We've been thinking," Charles began, "about the financial arrangements for the wedding and afterward." The pause was loaded with meaning. I could see Marcus growing excited, probably assuming his family was about to offer significant financial support. Instead, I suspected we were about to receive a very different kind of proposal. "We'd like Sophia to sign a prenuptial agreement," Eleanor announced, her words falling into the silence like stones into still water. Marcus's face flushed immediately. "Mom, that's completely unnecessary." "Actually," Charles interrupted, "it's quite necessary. We've had some concerns brought to our attention." My phone felt heavy in my purse, Emma's warning about the private investigator taking on new significance. They knew something, or thought they did. The question was what they'd discovered, and how much of my carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. "What kind of concerns?" I asked quietly, though I was already calculating contingencies in my head. Patricia stepped forward, clearly relishing her role in whatever drama was unfolding. "Well, dear, we've learned some interesting things about your financial situation." The way she said financial situation suggested they thought they'd uncovered something scandalous. I waited, curious to see what their investigation had revealed, while Marcus grew increasingly agitated beside me. "This is ridiculous," Marcus declared. "Sophie doesn't have any money to hide. If anything, she needs protection." "Does she?" Charles asked quietly. "Because according to our research, your fiancé isn't quite the struggling freelancer she's pretended to be." The room fell silent. I could feel every eye on me, waiting for my reaction. Marcus turned to stare at me, confusion and hurt beginning to replace his initial defensiveness. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," I said carefully. "But I think there's been some misunderstanding." Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't kind. "No misunderstanding, dear. We know about the apartment in Manhattan, the one that costs $15,000 a month. We know about the car you keep in a private garage. We know about the offshore accounts." My mind raced as I processed what they thought they'd found. The Manhattan apartment belonged to Meridian Digital, used for high-profile client meetings. The car was registered to one of my shell companies. The offshore accounts were legitimate business structures, but I could see how they might appear suspicious to someone looking for evidence of financial deception. "Sophie?" Marcus's voice was small, confused. "What are they talking about?" I looked at the man I'd planned to marry, seeing the hurt and betrayal beginning to cloud his features. For a moment, I considered coming clean, explaining the truth about who I really was and why I'd hidden it. But then Patricia spoke again. "We know you've been lying to our son," she said triumphantly. "The question is what else you've been lying about. Are you married? Are you using him for citizenship? Are you involved in something illegal?" The accusations hit like physical blows, each one more offensive than the last. These people had taken the evidence of my success and twisted it into something sinister. They'd assumed the worst about my motivations without considering any innocent explanations. "Sophie," Marcus said again, his voice growing harder. "Answer them." I looked around the room at their faces. Eleanor's cold satisfaction, Patricia's gleeful malice, Bradley's smug superiority. Even Charles, who I'd thought was more reasonable, watched me with calculating eyes that suggested he saw me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. Finally, I looked at Marcus. The man I'd thought I loved, who I'd believed, loved me in return. Instead of defending me against his family's outrageous accusations, he was joining their inquisition. Instead of asking for explanations, he was demanding them. Instead of trusting the woman he'd asked to marry him, he was treating me like a criminal who'd been caught in a lie. "You know what?" I said quietly, reaching into my purse and pulling out the engagement ring he'd given me. "You're absolutely right. I have been lying." The admission sent a ripple of satisfaction through the room. Marcus stepped back as if I'd struck him. "But not about what you think," I continued, setting the ring on the marble coffee table where it caught the light like an accusation. "I've been lying about something much more fundamental than money." I paused, looking at each of them in turn, seeing the anticipation in their faces as they waited for whatever confession they expected to hear. "I've been lying about who I am," I said, "about what I want, about what I'm willing to accept." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, clearly expecting details about secret marriages or criminal activities. Instead, I stood up, smoothing my dress with hands that were completely steady. "I've been pretending to be someone small enough for your son to feel big, someone weak enough to make him feel strong, someone grateful enough to accept being treated like a charity case by people who think money is the measure of worth." Kiekain. Room's energy shifted as my words registered. This wasn't the confession they'd expected. But the biggest lie, I continued, is that I've been pretending to love someone who gets excited about having power over me. Someone who finds my supposed struggles amusing rather than concerning. Someone who doesn't defend me against his family's attacks but joins them instead. Marcus's face had gone pale. Sophie, wait. No, I interrupted. I'm done waiting. Done pretending. Done playing a role in someone else's fantasy about themselves. I picked up my purse, checking to make sure I had my phone. Emma would have my car waiting outside within minutes of my call. You want to know the truth about my finances? I asked, pausing at the salon entrance. I'm worth more than your entire family combined. I could buy this house as a weekend property and not check my account balance. The little freelance projects you've been so condescending about? I own the company that just acquired your father's biggest competitor. The silence was absolute now, but it was a different kind of quiet. Instead of anticipatory, it was stunned. The prenup is a wonderful idea, I continued. I'll have my lawyers draft one that protects my assets from fortune hunters and gold diggers. After all, you never know who might be after your money. I turned to leave, then paused for one final observation. Oh, and Marcus, the wine your father was saving for our wedding? I own the vineyard. Consider it my wedding gift to whoever you eventually marry. The click of my heels on marble was the only sound as I walked toward the front door, leaving behind 3 years of carefully constructed lies and the family who'd helped me realize what I actually deserved in a partner. My phone was already buzzing with Emma's response before I reached the sidewalk. The car was waiting, engine running, ready to take me back to my real life. As we pulled away from the mansion, I caught a glimpse of Marcus standing at the window, his family clustered behind him like scavengers around a carcass. For the first time in 3 years, I smiled without having to calculate the effect. The real game was just beginning. The silence in the Whitmore family salon stretched like a taut wire, threatening to snap under the weight of what had just occurred. Marcus stood frozen by the window, watching the sleek black Tesla disappear into the Manhattan evening, carrying with it everything he thought he understood about his life. Did she just say she owns Meridian Digital? Bradley whispered, his voice barely audible in the cavernous room. Eleanor had sunk into her Louis XVI chair, her perfectly composed facade cracking for the first time in decades. Charles stood behind her, his calculating mind already working through the implications of what they'd just witnessed. That's impossible, Patricia declared, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. She drives a Honda Civic. I've seen it. Marcus finally turned from the window, his face pale and drawn. She said she owns the vineyard. Dad, what vineyard was she talking about? Charles moved to the bar cart, pouring himself 3 fingers of whiskey with hands that weren't entirely steady. Chateau Beaumont, the Bordeaux collection. I bought cases from them last month for $40,000. The number hung in the air like an accusation. If Sophia owned Chateau Beaumont, she wasn't just wealthy. She was operating in financial circles that made the Whitmore family fortune look modest. We need to verify this, Eleanor said, reaching for her phone. Patricia, call Detective Morrison. He handled the investigation. While Patricia fumbled with her phone, Marcus slumped onto the cream silk sofa, his head in his hands. The emerald engagement ring sat on the coffee table before him like evidence of a crime he was only beginning to understand he'd committed. 3 years, he muttered. 3 years of her letting me pay for everything. 3 years of me feeling like the generous boyfriend taking care of his struggling girlfriend. Bradley moved to the window where Marcus had been standing, as if the view might provide answers to questions they were only beginning to formulate. Remember Christmas dinner? When Uncle Robert was bragging about his portfolio, and she just smiled and changed the subject? The memory hit different now. What they'd interpreted as polite discomfort from someone out of her financial depth took on an entirely new meaning. Charles set down his whiskey glass with deliberate precision, She wasn't uncomfortable because she couldn't relate to money talk. She was uncomfortable because she was pretending not to. "Morrison's not answering," Patricia announced, lowering her phone. "But I'm looking up Meridian Digital right now." Eleanor rose from her chair with regal composure, though the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her inner turmoil. "Marcus, what exactly do you know about Sophia's work? Her real work, not the stories she told us." Marcus lifted his head, trying to focus through the fog of betrayal and confusion. "She said she did freelance graphic design, small clients, local businesses. She was always working late, taking calls at weird hours. Said it was because she was dealing with different time zones for international clients." "International clients," Charles repeated slowly. For a freelance graphic designer, the pieces were clicking together like a puzzle none of them had realized they were solving. Patricia's typing grew more frantic as she searched deeper into Meridian Digital's corporate structure. "Marcus," Eleanor said quietly, "show me her apartment. The one in Brooklyn where you thought she lived." Marcus pulled out his phone with numb fingers, scrolling through his photo gallery until he found pictures of Sophia's supposed home. The small, cluttered space with mismatched furniture and secondhand decorations. The tiny kitchen with discount store appliances. The single bedroom with a Murphy bed and a desk covered in what he'd assumed were client projects. It was always so cramped, Marcus said, staring at the photos. "She said she was saving up to move somewhere bigger. I offered to help with rent multiple times, but she said she wanted to be independent." Charles studied the images over his son's shoulder. "This looks staged." "What do you mean staged?" Eleanor demanded. "Look at the details. The artwork on the walls. Those aren't prints from a furniture store. That's original work from emerging artists. The laptop on her desk isn't a consumer model. It's a high-end workstation that costs $15,000. The coffee maker looks modest, but it's a La Marzocco Linea Mini. Those retail for $4,000. Patricia looked up from her phone, her face pale. Meridian Digital's client list includes Tesla, Goldman Sachs, and the Democratic National Committee. Their smallest retainer is $200,000 per month. The room fell silent again as the magnitude of Sophia's deception became clear. This wasn't a simple case of hidden assets or undisclosed income. This was a complete fabrication of identity, maintained with precision and discipline over 3 years. "She played us," Bradley said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and horror. "She played all of us." Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace where family photos lined the mantelpiece. In several of them, Sophia smiled beside him at various family events, her expressions now seeming calculated rather than genuine. "Why?" he asked the room. "If she had all this money, all this power, why pretend to be poor? Why waste 3 years on this elaborate lie?" Charles finished his whiskey, studying his son with the analytical gaze that had built the family fortune. "The question isn't why she lied, Marcus. The question is what she was planning to do with the truth." Eleanor moved to the window, watching the street below as if expecting Sophia to return and explain herself. "She said she's worth more than our entire family combined. Is that possible?" Patricia continued typing, her searches growing more specific. According to Forbes, Meridian Digital was valued at $800 million in their last private funding round. If she owns the majority stake, the implication hung unspoken. The Whitmore family fortune, accumulated over 3 generations, was worth approximately $200 million. They had just insulted and alienated someone worth 4 times their net worth. She also said she acquired Dad's biggest competitor. Bradley added, pulling out his own phone. "Whitmore Investments' biggest competitor is Meridian Capital Management." Charles went very still. "Meridian Capital handles institutional investments for pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. They manage $40 billion in assets. Is there a connection?" Eleanor asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Bradley's face was grim as he read from his screen. Meridian Capital was acquired last month by a private equity firm called Beaumont Holdings. Guess who owns Beaumont? Holdings? Marcus sank back onto the sofa, the full scope of Sophia's empire becoming clear. She wasn't just wealthy. She was operating a business empire that intersected with their lives at multiple points. The wine they drank, the competitors they faced, the very economic ecosystem they operated in. "She's been watching us," Marcus said quietly. "For 3 years, she's been inside our family, listening to our business discussions, learning our strategies, understanding our weaknesses." "But why?" Patricia insisted. "What did she want?" Charles moved to his desk, pulling out a leather portfolio filled with business documents. "Maybe she wanted to understand us before she destroyed us. Know your enemy before you strike." "Or maybe," Eleanor said slowly, "she was looking for something else entirely. Something she thought she could find in our family." Marcus looked up at his mother, seeing an unexpected gentleness in her expression. "What do you mean?" "Think about her behavior tonight. She didn't deny the accusations about the money. She confirmed them. But she was angry about something else entirely." Marcus replayed Sophia's final words, trying to understand what his mother was suggesting. The pain in Sophia's voice when she talked about pretending to be small enough for him to feel big. The hurt when she described being treated like a charity case. She wanted to be loved for who she really was, he realized. But she was afraid we'd only love her money. "So she tested us," Charles added grimly. "She gave us the opportunity to love her without the influence of wealth. And we failed." The weight of their collective failure settled over the room like a funeral shroud. They had been given 3 years to demonstrate their character, and instead, they had revealed themselves to be exactly the kind of people Sophia had been trying to avoid. "We have to fix this," Marcus said, reaching for his phone. "I have to call her, explain—" "Explain what?" Eleanor interrupted. "That we hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on her, that we assumed the worst about her motivations, that we ambushed her with a prenup designed to protect us from someone we thought was after our money." Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen and his face went white. "What is it?" Bradley demanded. Marcus held up his phone. The message was from Sophia's number. "My lawyers will contact you about retrieving my personal items from your apartment. Please don't attempt to contact me directly." "She's serious," Patricia whispered. "She's really done with us." Charles moved to the window, staring out at the city lights. Somewhere in that glittering landscape, Sophia was probably in her real home. Not the cramped Brooklyn apartment that had been another elaborate prop, but whatever palace she actually inhabited. "We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with," he said finally. "Patricia, I want a complete background check on everything Sophia owns, everyone she knows, every business she's connected to. If we're going to make this right, we need to know who we're really dealing with." "And if we can't make it right?" Marcus asked. Charles turned back to his family, his expression grim. "Then we need to understand exactly how much damage she can do to us. Because someone with her resources and her knowledge of our business operations could destroy everything we've built." Eleanor sank back into her chair, looking older than her 65 years. 3 years. She spent 3 years learning everything about us, while we learned nothing about her. "She was planning something," Bradley said with growing certainty. "This whole thing was planned from the beginning. The charity auction where they met, the shy freelancer act, the modest apartment, all of it designed to get inside our family." Marcus shook his head, though he couldn't entirely dismiss his cousin's theory. "If she wanted to hurt us, she's had 3 years to do it. Why wait? Why go through with the engagement?" "Maybe she was waiting for the right moment," Patricia suggested. "Maybe tonight was always part of the plan." As if summoned by their speculation, Charles's phone rang. He glanced at the display and frowned. "It's Jenkins from the office. At this hour?" He answered the call, putting it on speaker. Jenkins's voice filled the room, tight with barely controlled panic. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry to call so late, but we have a situation. Meridian Capital just announced they're calling in the Hartwell Industries loan, effective immediately. They want full repayment within 30 days, or they're foreclosing on all collateral." The room went dead silent. The Hartwell Industries loan was the largest outstanding debt in Whitmore Investments' portfolio, $40 million secured against properties that would take months to liquidate. "That's impossible," Charles said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The loan isn't due for another 2 years. They're exercising an acceleration clause, something about material changes in the borrower's creditworthiness. Sir, if we can't cover this, it's going to wipe out our liquid reserves." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. $40 million in 30 days. It was possible, but barely, and it would leave their firm dangerously exposed to any other financial pressures. Charles ended the call and looked at his family with grim understanding. "She's started." "Started what?" Eleanor asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. "The consequences," Marcus said quietly. "She told us this was just the beginning." Through the windows of the Whitmore mansion, the city lights sparkled like diamonds scattered on black velvet. Somewhere in that maze of glass and steel, Sophia was probably sitting in her real office, orchestrating their destruction with the same methodical precision she'd used to orchestrate her 3-year deception. The game had indeed just begun, and they were only now realizing they'd never understood the rules. Marcus picked up the engagement ring from the coffee table, closing his fist around the emerald that had once symbolized their future together. Now it felt like evidence of his own foolishness, a reminder of how completely he'd misunderstood the woman he thought he loved. The question wasn't whether they could fix what they'd broken. The question was whether they would survive what came next. 24 hours after the confrontation at the Whitmore mansion, Sophia Chen stood in her actual office on the 52nd floor of One World Trade Center, watching the sun rise over Manhattan through floor-to-ceiling windows. The city spread beneath her like a chessboard, each building a piece in games she'd been playing for years. Emma Rivera, her chief of staff, entered with 2 cups of coffee and a tablet loaded with overnight developments. Unlike the careful performance Sophia had maintained for the Whitmores, here she moved with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to wielding power. "The Hartwell acceleration worked perfectly," Emma reported, settling into the chair across from Sophia's glass desk. "Charles Whitmore spent most of the night on conference calls trying to arrange emergency financing." Sophia accepted her coffee, a blend from beans grown on estates she owned in 3 different countries. "And the other dominoes?" Peterson Holdings withdrew their letter of credit for the Whitmore's Thames project. Without that guarantee, construction stops Monday. The Singapore Development Partnership is asking for additional collateral that they don't have liquid. Marcus's personal investment in that cryptocurrency startup? Emma paused for effect. The SEC just announced they're investigating it for fraud. Each piece of news was delivered with clinical precision, but Sophia felt no satisfaction. The Hartwell loan acceleration had been planned months ago as a contingency, triggered by a simple phone call the night before. The Peterson Holdings withdrawal was equally straightforward. She owned 60% of Peterson Holdings through a web of shell companies the Whitmores had never bothered to trace. "How are they responding?" Sophia asked, though surveillance. Reports would give her the details soon enough. Emma consulted her tablet. "Panic, mostly. Marcus called you 17 times last night before his lawyer advised him to stop. Eleanor tried to arrange a meeting through 3 different intermediaries. Charles is liquidating his art collection." Through the window, Sophia could see the Hudson River reflecting the morning light. 3 years ago, she'd stood on the deck of Marcus's family yacht at the annual regatta, listening to him explain how family money was different from new money, how it carried responsibilities and traditions that outsiders couldn't understand. "The yacht is being repossessed this morning," Emma continued, following Sophia's gaze. Their insurance company is also reviewing all policies. Apparently, there were some questions about asset valuations that need clarification. Sophia had spent 18 months learning the intricate details of Whitmore family finances, not through corporate espionage, but through pillow talk and family dinners. Marcus had been proud of his financial acumen, explaining investment strategies, and sharing family business details with the woman he thought was too naive to understand their significance. Bradley Whitmore's hedge fund is hemorrhaging investors, Emma reported. Turns out when you're managing money for people who think you have family connections and inside information, they get nervous when your family starts looking financially unstable. The cascade was beautiful in its efficiency. Sophia hadn't attacked the Whitmores directly. That would have been crude and potentially illegal. Instead, she'd simply removed the artificial supports that had been keeping their over-leveraged empire stable. The house of cards was collapsing under its own weight. "Ma'am," Emma said carefully, "the lawyers are asking about endgame parameters. How far do you want this to go?" Sophia turned from the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. For 3 years, she'd been someone else entirely, suppressing her natural instincts for strategic thinking and decisive action. The return to her authentic self felt like emerging from underwater, each breath easier than the last. Schedule a meeting with their attorneys for Friday. The Meridian Conference Room. Emma made notes on her tablet. "What terms are you prepared to offer?" "That depends on what they're prepared to acknowledge." The intercom buzzed with a call from security. "Ms. Chen, Marcus Whitmore is in the lobby requesting to see you. He's not on the approved list." Sophia considered for a moment. Marcus had never been to this building, had never seen her real office or met her actual staff. The contrast between the woman he'd known and the executive he was about to encounter might be educational for both of them. "Send him up, but have security escort him." Emma raised an eyebrow. "You sure that's wise?" "Probably not," Sophia replied, "but I'm curious to see how he handles meeting the real me." 10 minutes later, Marcus stepped into Sophia's office, flanked by 2 discreet security guards. He wore the same expensive suit from the night before, now wrinkled and disheveled. His usually perfect hair was uncombed, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights and desperate phone calls. The office itself was a testament to understated power. Minimalist furniture worth more than most people's houses, original artwork from collections that were usually seen only in museums, and a view that literally looked down on the rest of Manhattan. This was the environment where Sophia naturally belonged, and Marcus could see it immediately. "Jesus Christ, Sophie," he breathed, taking in the scope of what she'd hidden from him. "This is really who you are." "This is who I've always been," Sophia corrected, not rising from her desk. "The question is whether you're capable of seeing me as anything other than the fiction you preferred." Marcus moved deeper into the office, his gaze cataloging details that contradicted everything he thought he knew. The personal photos on her desk showed her with world leaders and Fortune 500 CEOs. The awards lining one wall included recognition from organizations he'd only read about in business journals. "Why?" he asked, finally focusing on her face. "Why the elaborate lie? Why not just tell me who you really were?" Sophia leaned back in her chair, studying the man she'd once planned to marry. "Because I wanted to know if you could love me without the money. I wanted to see if you were different from the others." "What others?" "The 3 men before you who fell in love with my portfolio instead of my personality, who saw me as a business opportunity rather than a person. I thought if I removed the financial element, I might find something genuine." Marcus sank into the chair Emma had vacated, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. "And did you find something genuine?" Sophia considered the question carefully. There had been moments, quiet Sunday mornings in the Brooklyn apartment, walks through Central Park where Marcus forgot to perform his wealth for her benefit, conversations about books and movies where his intelligence showed without the need to demonstrate superiority. "For a while," she admitted. But then you started enjoying the power imbalance. You liked being the one with resources, the one in control. You liked having someone you could rescue. That's not true. Marcus, Sophia interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to boardroom confrontations. You introduced me to your colleagues as your charity case girlfriend at the Thompson Industries Gala. You told Bradley I gave you perspective on how the other half lives. You enjoyed having power over me more than you enjoyed having me as an equal. The accusation hit home, and Marcus's shoulders sagged with the weight of recognition. The prenup wasn't about protecting family money, was it? You knew we'd react that way. I hoped you wouldn't, Sophia replied honestly. I hoped when your family attacked me, you'd defend me. I hoped when they accused me of ulterior motives, you'd trust the woman you claimed to love. Instead, you joined the Inquisition. Marcus looked around the office again, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what they'd lost. So, this is punishment? You're destroying my family's business because we hurt your feelings? The reduction of her response to wounded emotions revealed how little he still understood about who she was. Sophia pulled up a file on her computer screen, turning the monitor so Marcus could see the contents. This is a compilation of every discriminatory comment, every instance of financial manipulation, and every unethical business practice your family has engaged in over the past 5 years, she said. The Hartwell loan acceleration was legitimate. They violated 3 separate covenants last quarter. The Peterson Holdings withdrawal was contractually justified. Your family failed to meet agreed-upon milestones. The insurance reviews are routine when asset valuations don't match reported figures. Marcus scanned the document, his face growing paler with each page. You've been building a case against us for 3 years. I've been documenting what was already there, Sophia corrected. Your family's business practices created vulnerabilities long before I arrived. I simply learned what they were. And now you're using that information to destroy us. Sophia closed the file and leaned forward, her elbows on the desk. I'm allowing natural consequences to occur. There's a difference. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. What do you want, Sophie? What would it take to stop this? The question hung in the air between them like a bridge that could be crossed or burned. Sophia felt the weight of 3 years of deception, months of planning, and the genuine hurt of realizing that the man she'd thought she loved had valued her perceived weakness more than her actual strength. I want acknowledgement, she said finally. I want your family to understand that their treatment of me wasn't about protecting themselves from a gold digger. It was about their inability to accept that someone they deemed inferior might actually be their superior. And then we'll discuss whether the Whitmore family has learned enough about humility to deserve a second chance. Marcus stood slowly, perhaps realizing that the woman across the desk held his family's future in her hands. Sophie, I know I screwed up. We all did. But destroying everything my family built isn't going to fix what happened between us. You're right, Sophia agreed, but rebuilding from honest foundations might. She pressed a button on her desk and the security guard stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore was just leaving. Please escort him to the lobby. As Marcus reached the office door, he turned back one final time. For what it's worth, I did love you. Not the money, not the power, the person I thought you were. Sophia met his gaze across the expanse of her real office, surrounded by the evidence of who she actually was. The person you thought I was doesn't exist, Marcus. She never did. The question is whether you can love the person I actually am. After he left, Sophia stood at her windows again, watching the city pulse with morning energy. Emma returned with updates on the cascading effects of the previous night's revelation. 3 more major investors pulled out of Bradley's fund this morning, Emma reported. The family's requesting an emergency board meeting at Whitmore Investments. And Charles wants to know if you'd be willing to consider a private settlement discussion. Sophia thought about Marcus's question. What would it take to stop this? The truth was, she wasn't trying to destroy the Whitmore family. She was trying to teach them something they'd never been forced to learn, that actions have consequences, that privilege doesn't protect you from accountability, and that underestimating people based on superficial assumptions was dangerous. Set up the meeting for Friday, she decided. But not here. Neutral territory. The Meridian conference room at the Plaza. Emma nodded, making notes. What parameters should I give their attorneys? Sophia considered the question carefully. The Whitmore family was facing financial ruin, social humiliation, and the collapse of everything they'd built their identity around. They were experiencing, perhaps for the first time, what it felt like to be powerless. Tell them we'll discuss terms once they're prepared to have an honest conversation about what happened. No lawyers, no posturing, no attempts to minimize their behavior, just truth. As Emma left to make arrangements, Sophia remained at the windows, watching the city that had always been her true home. Somewhere below, the Whitmore family was learning what it meant to face consequences for their choices. The question now was whether they were capable of growth or whether some lessons could only be learned through complete destruction. Friday would tell her everything she needed to know. Friday afternoon arrived with the weight of an execution date. The Meridian conference room at the Plaza Hotel was neutral territory in the truest sense, elegant enough to suit the Whitmore family's sensibilities, but owned by one of Sophia's subsidiary companies through a chain of holdings they'd never bothered to investigate. Charles Whitmore entered first, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. His Armani suit couldn't disguise the weight loss from 3 days of crisis management, and his silver hair lacked its typical, perfect styling. Eleanor followed, her composure intact, but her eyes carrying the haunted look of someone who'd discovered her world wasn't as solid as she'd believed. Marcus came last, flanked by his mother's disapproving glare and his father's grim determination. He'd aged years in the 5 days since their confrontation, his boyish confidence replaced by something approaching wisdom, though it might have been too late for such growth to matter. Sophia was already seated at the head of the mahogany conference table, her presence transforming the ornate room into something resembling a courtroom. She wore a navy Chanel suit that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, her only jewelry a pair of diamond earrings that caught the afternoon light filtering through silk curtains. "Thank you for coming," she said, as they settled into chairs that suddenly felt like defendants' benches. "I thought it was time we had an honest conversation." Charles opened a leather portfolio, his movements betraying the corporate attorney he'd once been before inheriting the family business. "Our lawyers have advised us that this meeting could be construed as an admission of..." Charles. Sophia's voice cut through his legal positioning with the authority of someone accustomed to boardroom control. "I said honest conversation. That means no lawyers, no scripted responses, and no attempts to manage the narrative. Just truth." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably, her fingers worrying the Cartier bracelet that had become a nervous habit since learning their liquid assets might not cover next month's expenses. "What exactly do you want from us, Sophia?" The question carried layers of meaning. What would it cost to end this nightmare? What price would buy their family's survival? What terms would restore the comfortable superiority they'd taken for granted? "I want you to understand what you did," Sophia replied, her tone neither harsh nor gentle, simply factual. "Not what you think you did, or what you've convinced yourselves was justified, but what actually happened." Marcus leaned forward, perhaps hoping his personal connection might carry weight in these negotiations. "Sophie, we know we made mistakes." "Do you?" Sophia interrupted, pulling out a tablet and setting it on the conference table. "Let's test that theory." With a swipe of her finger, the room's wall-mounted screen came to life, displaying a timeline that made the Whitmore family collectively flinch. 3 years of data points, each one documenting an interaction, a conversation, a moment that revealed their true attitudes toward the woman they'd thought was beneath their social station. December 15th, 2021. Sophia began, reading from the timeline. Eleanor, you told Patricia that I was sweet but clearly not from our world, and worried about what people would think at the country club. Eleanor's face flushed, but she didn't deny the statement. The country club comment had been made at a Christmas luncheon, overheard by a server who happened to be on Meridian Digital's payroll for market research purposes. March 8th, 2022. Charles, you advised Marcus to enjoy himself with me but suggested he might want to find someone more appropriate for the long term before he turned 35. Charles's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. The conversation had taken place in his private office, but Sophia's reach apparently extended even there through methods he was only beginning to understand. June 20th, 2022. Marcus, you told Bradley that dating me was like having a pet, charming and loyal, but ultimately not an intellectual equal. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, his face going white as he remembered the casual cruelty of the observation. He'd been drunk at Bradley's bachelor party, showing off for his cousin with observations that felt clever in the moment, but revealed something ugly about his character. Should I continue? Sophia asked, her finger hovering over the tablet. I have 3 years of documentation. Every condescending comment, every moment you made me feel small, every time you treated me like a fascinating specimen rather than an equal partner. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Each family member stared at the screen, seeing their private thoughts and casual cruelties laid bare with timestamps and context that made denial impossible. We didn't know you were listening, Eleanor said weakly, as if surveillance justified the sentiment. Behind their words. You didn't care if I was listening, Sophia corrected. You assumed I was too naive to understand, too grateful for your acceptance to object, too powerless to matter. Charles closed his portfolio, perhaps realizing that legal strategies were useless against someone who'd been building a case for 3 years. What do you want us to say? That we misjudged you? That we're sorry? I want you to understand why you misjudged me, Sophia replied, advancing the timeline to show a different set of data points. Every time you dismissed my suggestions, I was offering solutions worth millions. Every time you laughed at my naive questions about business, I was testing whether you understood your own industry. Every time you treated me like a charity case, I was evaluating whether your family deserved what I could offer. The screen now showed a different story. Sophia's suggestions about the Thompson account that Marcus had dismissed, her questions about cryptocurrency investments that Charles had laughed off, her concerns about over-leveraging that Eleanor had attributed to poor person anxiety about debt. The Thompson account restructuring that saved you $12 million last year? That was my strategy, fed to you through intermediaries because you wouldn't listen to it from me directly. Sophia's voice remained steady, but Marcus could see the hurt underneath the professional composure. The cryptocurrency warnings that could have saved Bradley's fund? I tried to explain the market instability at your birthday dinner, Charles. You told me to let the adults handle complex financial matters. Each revelation was worse than the last, painting a picture of systematic dismissal that went beyond casual condescension into active sabotage of their own interests. They'd been so committed to maintaining their sense of superiority that they'd rejected valuable counsel from someone who understood their business better than they did. The Hartwell Industries loan that's destroying your liquidity? Sophia continued. I warned Marcus 6 months ago that their fundamentals were unsound. He told me I was worrying too much about things I didn't understand. Marcus buried his face in his hands, the weight of his arrogance becoming unbearable. Oh God, Sophie. We were so stupid. You were so arrogant, she corrected. There's a difference. Stupidity can be fixed with education. Arrogance requires consequences. Eleanor looked up from the screen where her own failures were documented in devastating detail. So this is punishment? You're destroying everything we built because we hurt your feelings? The reduction of Sophia's response to wounded emotions was exactly the kind of dismissal that had brought them to this moment. Charles seemed to recognize this, shooting his wife a warning look, but the damage was already done. Eleanor, Sophia, said with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Your family's empire is collapsing because it was built on unstable foundations. I didn't create your vulnerabilities. I simply stopped protecting you from them. She pulled up another screen showing the intricate web of financial relationships that had kept Whitmore Investments profitable despite increasingly risky decisions. Shell companies that had provided artificial stability, loans that had been restructured through sympathetic institutions, contracts that had been steered through personal relationships rather than competitive bidding. For 3 years, I quietly supported your business through companies you didn't know I owned, Sophia explained. The Peterson Holdings credit line that kept your Thames project alive? My company? The Singapore partners who overlooked your missed milestones? My contacts? The favorable insurance rates that kept your premiums manageable? My influence? The family stared at the screen in stunned silence, watching their financial ecosystem reveal itself as an elaborate support system orchestrated by the woman they'd treated as a burden. Every success they'd celebrated, every crisis they'd survived, every stroke of good fortune that had kept their empire stable, all of it had been Sophia's invisible hand guiding their fate. You weren't supporting us, Marcus said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. You were propping us up. I was protecting the family I hoped to join, Sophia confirmed. I wanted to see if you deserved that protection. Charles ran his hands through his silver hair, looking older than his 68 years. And we proved we didn't. You proved you were more interested in feeling superior than being successful, more committed to maintaining hierarchies than maximizing profits, more concerned with preserving your egos than protecting your empire. The assessment was delivered without malice, which somehow made it more devastating. This wasn't anger speaking. It was professional evaluation from someone who understood business at levels they'd never achieved. So what happens now? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia stood and walked to the windows overlooking Central Park, where couples strolled through autumn leaves in the golden afternoon light. For a moment, she looked less like a corporate predator and more like a woman contemplating what might have been. That depends on whether you're capable of learning from this experience, she said without turning around. Whether you can acknowledge what you did wrong and why it was wrong, not just that it had consequences you don't like. Eleanor straightened in her chair, some of her old dignity returning. We treated you badly. We were condescending and dismissive and cruel. We're sorry. Are you sorry because you hurt me, or because I turned out to be powerful enough to hurt you back? The question hung in the air like a test that could determine their family's survival. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, perhaps realizing that her first instinct proved Sophia's point. Charles stood slowly, moving to join Sophia at the windows. You're asking us to examine our character, not just apologize for our behavior. I'm asking you to prove you understand the difference. Marcus rose from his chair, crossing the room to stand beside the 2 people who held his family's fate in their hands. Sophie, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I proved myself unworthy of the woman you actually are. But my family, they don't deserve to lose everything because I was too arrogant to see your value. Sophia finally turned from the windows, studying Marcus's face with the analytical gaze she'd learned to hide for 3 years. Your family enabled and encouraged your behavior, Marcus. They shared your assumptions, supported your condescension, and participated in treating me like a fascinating pet rather than an equal partner. This isn't about you. It's about all of you. The weight of collective responsibility settled over the room like a shroud. They'd all been complicit. All contributed to the toxic dynamic that had ultimately revealed their character to someone with the power to judge them. What would it take? Charles asked quietly. What would convince you that we're capable of growth? Sophia returned to the conference table, her decision apparently made during her contemplation at the windows. 3 things. First, public acknowledgement of what happened. Not the sanitized version you'll want to tell, but the truth about how you treated someone you perceived as inferior. The family exchanged glances, recognizing the social suicide she was describing. Public admission of their behavior would destroy their reputation in circles where superiority was currency. Second, restitution to every person your business practices have harmed over the past 5 years. Fair settlements, honest apologies, and commitment to better standards going forward. This would cost millions they no longer had, requiring liquidation of assets and surrender of lifestyle they'd considered birthright. Third, Sophia continued, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, genuine change. Not performance for my benefit, but actual evolution in how you treat people you consider beneath you. She paused, looking at each family member in turn. Do this, truly and completely, and I'll consider restoring the financial support that's been keeping your empire stable. Fail, and you'll face the natural consequences of your choices without any further intervention from me. The offer hung before them like a bridge across an abyss, humiliating but survivable, demanding but achievable. The question was whether their pride would allow them to cross it, or whether they'd choose destruction over growth. Marcus spoke first, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was accepting. We'll do it, whatever it takes. But Sophia was looking at his parents, recognizing that the real test lay with the generation that had shaped his character in the first place. Eleanor and Charles would determine whether the Whitmore family was capable of evolution, or whether some patterns were too deeply ingrained to change. The silence stretched as 2 people who'd never faced consequences for their choices contemplated, accepting responsibility for a lifetime of casual cruelty. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked toward sunset, marking time until their answer would determine whether the Whitmore name would survive the reckoning it had finally encountered. Eleanor was the first to break, her composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated revelations. You recorded everything, she whispered, staring at the dark screen that had displayed years of their private thoughts. 3 years of our lives, catalogued and analyzed like specimens under a microscope. I documented what you chose to reveal, Sophia corrected, her voice carrying no trace of apology. Your words, your actions, your character when you thought no one important was watching. Charles moved away from the windows, returning to his seat with the careful movements of someone who'd aged a decade in a single afternoon. The server at the Christmas luncheon, the office conversations. How many people were reporting to you? Enough to understand who you really are beneath the polished surface, Sophia replied. Market research companies employ thousands of people in service positions. Hotel staff, restaurant servers, maintenance workers, drivers. People you never bothered to notice, let alone consider, might have other loyalties. Marcus stared at his hands, perhaps finally grasping the scope of Sophia's network and the patience required to maintain her deception. You were building a case against us from the beginning. I was hoping I wouldn't need one, Sophia said, and for the first time, her professional facade showed cracks of genuine pain. Do you think I enjoyed pretending to be someone smaller than I am? Do you think it was fun to bite my tongue while you explained basic business concepts I'd mastered years before you graduated college? Eleanor straightened in her chair, some of her old fire returning. Then why did you do it? Why subject yourself to 3 years of pretense if you found us so distasteful? Because I wanted to believe that somewhere underneath the entitlement and casual cruelty, there were people worth loving. Sophia's admission hung in the air like a confession. I wanted to find the man Marcus could be when he wasn't performing his superiority. I wanted to discover if your family was capable of genuine warmth when you weren't worried about social hierarchies. The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension, heavier with the weight of lost possibilities and relationships that might have been real if different choices had been made. And did you? Marcus asked quietly, Find anything worth loving? Sophia considered the question, her gaze moving from face to face around the table. Moments. Charles, when you talked about your father building the business from nothing, there was genuine pride in honest work. Eleanor, when you organized that charity drive for homeless veterans, you showed real compassion. Marcus, when we walked through Central Park last winter and you helped that elderly woman with her groceries, you were kind without thinking about it. Each observation was delivered like evidence in a trial where the verdict remained uncertain. But those moments were exceptions, not the rule. And when tested, when faced with someone you perceived as inferior, you chose hierarchy over humanity every time. Patricia, who had remained silent throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke. So what happens to the rest of us? Bradley's children, the employees who depend on Whitmore investments, the charities Eleanor supports? Sophia pulled up a new screen on her tablet, displaying organizational charts and financial projections. The employees will be protected. I've already arranged positions at other firms for anyone displaced by restructuring. The charitable commitments will be honored through foundation funding. As for Bradley's fund, she paused, studying Patricia's face. Your husband made his own choices about risk management and due diligence. The consequences of those choices aren't my responsibility to mitigate. But you could save him, Patricia pressed. You have the resources. I could, Sophia agreed. The question is whether he deserves salvation or natural consequences. Charles leaned forward, his attorney instincts finally engaging with the negotiation at hand. You mentioned 3 conditions: public acknowledgement, restitution, and genuine change. What exactly would constitute fulfillment of those requirements? Sophia set down her tablet and folded her hands on the conference table, her posture suggesting they had finally reached the heart of the matter. Public acknowledgement means a press conference where you explain exactly what happened. Not spin, not damage control, but truth. You treated someone you perceived as your social inferior with casual cruelty for 3 years and discovered too late that your assumptions were wrong. Eleanor winced at the social implications. Their reputation in Manhattan's elite circles would be destroyed, their membership in exclusive clubs revoked, their invitations to important events permanently withdrawn. Restitution means identifying every person harmed by Whitmore family business practices over the past 5 years and making them whole, Sophia continued. The female executives passed over for promotion because Charles thought they weren't executive material. The minority contractors underpaid because Eleanor assumed they were grateful for any work. The employees terminated for raising concerns about ethical violations. The financial implications were staggering, requiring liquidation of personal assets they'd considered untouchable: the Fifth Avenue penthouse, the house in the Hamptons, Eleanor's jewelry collection, Charles's vintage car collection. All of it would need to be sold to fund restitution that should have been made years earlier. And genuine change? Marcus asked, though his voice suggested he dreaded the answer. Means proving that this experience taught you something fundamental about treating people with dignity, regardless of their perceived status, Sophia replied. I don't want apologies performed. For my benefit. I want evidence that you've internalized the lesson and applied it to how you interact with everyone. Servers, doormen, junior employees, anyone you've previously considered beneath your notice. She stood and walked to the window again, her silhouette framed against the darkening Manhattan skyline. Do this completely and authentically, and I'll restore the financial support that kept your empire stable. Your debts will be restructured, your credit lines restored, your business relationships rebuilt. The Whitmore name will survive, though. It will carry a different kind of reputation. And if we refuse? Charles asked, though the question seemed more procedural than defiant. Then you'll face the natural consequences of your choices without any interference from me, Sophia replied. The Hartwell loan will destroy your liquidity. The insurance investigations will reveal inflated valuations that constitute fraud. The SEC inquiry into Bradley's cryptocurrency investments will expand into broader family financial activities. You'll lose everything, probably face criminal charges, and learn what it feels like to be powerless. She turned back to the table, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. I'm not a vindictive person, despite what this situation might suggest. I don't want to destroy you. I want to teach you. But the lesson requires genuine acceptance of responsibility, not just strategic positioning to minimize damage, Marcus was the first to respond, rising from his chair with the careful dignity of someone accepting a necessary burden. I'll do it. The press conference, the restitution, all of it. Whatever it takes to prove that I can learn from this. It's not about proving anything to me, Marcus, Sophia said gently. It's about becoming someone worthy of the second chance. You're asking for. Eleanor looked at her son, seeing perhaps for the first time the man he could become if stripped of the arrogance that had defined his character. The social consequences will be severe. We'll be pariahs in our own circles. Those circles never accepted me, Sophia observed. Maybe it's time to find better ones. Charles stood slowly, his decision apparently made during the long silence. We'll do it. All 3 conditions, completely and publicly. When do you want to schedule the press conference? When you're ready to tell the truth, Sophia replied. Not when your lawyers have crafted the perfect statement. Not when your publicists have identified optimal timing. But when you're prepared to be honest about what happened and why it was wrong. She gathered her tablet and moved toward the door, then paused for one final observation. I fell in love with the potential I saw in Marcus during our quiet moments together. I respected the business acumen Charles showed when he wasn't performing, his superiority. I admired Eleanor's genuine compassion for causes she cared about. Those glimpses of your better selves convinced me to invest 3 years in this relationship. Her hand rested on the door handle, but she didn't turn it. The question now is whether those better selves were real or just another performance, designed to get something you wanted. Marcus stepped forward, his voice carrying a sincerity that had been absent during most of their relationship. Sophie, if we do this, if we meet your conditions and prove we've changed, is there any possibility that you and I— Marcus? Sophia interrupted gently. I can't unknow what I learned about your character these past 3 years. I can't unfeel the casual cruelty or unhear the condescending comments. Even if you become everything I hoped you could be, too much damage has been done. The finality in her voice was unmistakable, and Marcus's shoulders sagged with the weight of opportunities irretrievably lost. I understand. But, Sophia continued, if you genuinely change, if you become someone who treats all people with dignity regardless of their perceived status, then maybe someday we can be friends. Maybe you can find someone else who sees your growth and chooses to build something with the man you've become, rather than the man you were. She opened the door, then looked back one final time. You have 1 week to make your decision. After that, the offer expires and you face whatever consequences your choices have earned. As Sophia left the conference room, the Whitmore family remained seated around the mahogany table, contemplating the choice between humiliating redemption and dignified destruction. The golden afternoon light faded from the windows, replaced by the harsh glitter of city lights that seemed to mock their reduced circumstances. Eleanor broke the silence first. She's right, you know, about all of it. Charles nodded slowly, looking older than his years, but perhaps wiser than he'd been that morning. We were so focused on protecting ourselves from gold diggers that we never considered we might be the ones with character deficiencies. Marcus stared at the engagement ring still sitting on the table, its emerald surface reflecting the overhead, lights like tears. I loved her, he said quietly. I really did. But I loved the version of her that made me feel important, more than the person she actually was. The press conference will destroy our reputation, Eleanor said, stating the obvious consequence they all understood. Our reputation was built on a lie, Charles replied. Maybe it's time to build a new one on truth. Patricia, who had been calculating the financial implications throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. The restitution will cost everything. The houses, the art collection, my jewelry, the children's trust funds. We'll be middle class. We'll be honest, Eleanor corrected, and for the first time in years, her voice carried genuine pride rather than social posturing. Marcus picked up the engagement ring, closing his fist around it one final time. When do we schedule the press conference? Tomorrow, Charles said decisively, before we lose our courage or our lawyers convince us to minimize the truth. As they filed out of the conference room, each family member carried the weight of impending humiliation and the possibility of redemption. The Whitmore empire would fall, their social standing would crumble, and their comfortable superiority would be stripped away. But for the first time in years, they would face the world as they truly were, rather than as they pretended to be. 6. Months later, Marcus stood in the reception area of a homeless shelter in Queens, wearing jeans and a polo shirt instead of his usual Armani suits. His hands, once soft from a lifetime of privilege, now showed calluses from construction work, helping rebuild homes for families displaced by economic hardship. The press conference had indeed destroyed their social standing, but it had also freed them from the exhausting performance of superiority that had defined their lives. Charles had taken a position as a financial advisor for nonprofit organizations, using his expertise to help causes rather than maximize profits. Eleanor had become a full-time volunteer coordinator, her organizational skills finally serving people who genuinely needed help, rather than entertaining the already privileged. Shelter's director, a woman named Maria, whose own story included homelessness and recovery, approached Marcus with a clipboard. The Chen Foundation sent another donation, she said, handing him the paperwork. Anonymous, but the amount will fund our expansion for another year. Marcus smiled, recognizing Sophia's invisible hand continuing to support causes that mattered. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd never returned to the elaborate deception of her Brooklyn apartment, instead living openly as the successful businesswoman she'd always been. Her company had expanded internationally, her reputation for ethical business practices attracting clients who valued integrity over maximum profit. Any word on the job training program? Marcus asked, reviewing the foundation's latest contribution. Starting next month, Maria replied. Apparently, Ms. Chen herself will be teaching some of the business skills workshops. Marcus felt a familiar pang at hearing Sophia's name, but it was tinged with gratitude rather than regret. The man who had mocked her supposed poverty now understood that her greatest wealth had never been financial. It was her capacity for genuine compassion paired with the power to act on it. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the news about the shelter expansion. You're becoming someone worth knowing. Marcus smiled, understanding that this might be the beginning of the friendship Sophia had suggested was possible if he truly changed. It wouldn't be the romantic future he'd once imagined, but it was something more valuable. The respect of someone whose judgment he'd learned to trust. As evening fell over Queens, Marcus helped serve dinner to families who had lost their homes to circumstances beyond their control. Each interaction was an opportunity to practice the dignity and respect he'd failed to show Sophia during their 3 years together. The Whitmore family fortune was gone, their social standing destroyed, their comfortable superiority permanently shattered. But in its place, they'd found something they'd never possessed during their years of wealth and privilege. The knowledge that their worth as human beings wasn't measured by their bank accounts or social connections, but by how they treated people who had nothing to offer them in return. It had taken the complete destruction of everything they thought mattered to learn what actually did. And perhaps, in time, that lesson would prove more valuable than anything they'd lost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.